Welcome to our exciting lecture today on benevolent possession. Now, I've already posited that there are two types of possession, malevolent possession and benevolent possession. So in a prior lecture, we talked about malevolent possession. In particular, we talked about how the ghosts of the unhappy dead, typically the male unhappy dead, afflict women in Tamil Nadu, young brides, and through the process of their possession and exorcism, the young brides are recoded to be good brides instead of bad brides. Well, we're on to something else here. In benevolent possession, we see that the person who is possessed gets something positive out of it, or at least just something not negative. And I would argue that benevolent possession is encountered far more often than people would realize within Hinduism and throughout South Asian culture. And I would even argue that some elements of this benevolent possession is a very dynamic aspect of religion found around the world. So what is possession in general? Well, there is an entity, and that entity is either a deity, a spirit, a godling, a demigod, or a little god. I like the term spirit being. And when this person sort of takes over another person, when this entity takes over the person who is possessed, they don't do any harm. The deity or the spirit being takes over, but the reason is for good, and the qualities and what happens is for good. The one who is possessed is, in fact, enters into a sort of like a holy state of sort. The sacred nature of this spirit being or deity spills over into the possessed vessel. So in this sense, the person who is possessed acts as the god, is a witness of, or is not a witness of the god, but is almost an embodiment of the god. In Hinduism in general, we see that this category of human and divine is permeable. It's not distinct. It's neither one nor the other. So the divine can exist in a human form, and humans can become divine, which is a whole other kettle of fish. So there are two ways to sort of interpret benevolent possession. The first is an altered state of consciousness, or ASC, as we are now using in religious studies. And the other is trance. And then the other is, let me say that again. There are two ways to think about this benevolent possession. And one, it's that the person who is possessed goes into an altered state of consciousness or into a trance. And in the other, we're actively looking at the spirit being as an active agent. We're saying this is a real entity that's operating, that's different than the person in their normal state of consciousness. I find both of these ideas useful. What's not useful, though, when you're kind of thinking about possession? Well, what's not useful is to say, oh, these people are faking it, or these people are mentally ill. Faking it is hard to disprove. And what does it mean to authentically be religious? I think we could argue about that forever and never get anywhere on it. But the other arguments, such as for mental illness, we have research that shows that people who have benevolent possession do not show up as being mentally ill. On the other hand, when you see folk who experience malevolent possession, we do see a high incidence of mental illness there. Okay, so let's think about the difference between trance or altered states of consciousness and possession. Well, in trance, someone enters an altered state of consciousness, but a person in a trance is not necessarily possessed. We can go into a trance but not be possessed by an entity. So in my experiences, trance can happen from music, it can happen from religious rituals. You can have a mystical state in which you go into a trance and sort of like it's timeless and it's like a mystical state. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're being sort of inhabited by another entity. There is a thing called trance channeling, in which there's a number of sort of new religious movements that come out of trance channeling. In this, the person sort of connects to an entity or a force, and they can speak for that force or connect to that force and channel ways in which that non-physical force might be able to speak through them or even speak through their writing. So you have that famous book, A Course on Miracles, which they have a congregation right around the corner from my house, which is about a trance-channeled or revealed text in which it was actually a New York Jewish psychologist sort of began receiving these messages that were able to be put into this book, The Course in Miracles. So in trance states in general, people report entering a timeless state or being out of body or thoroughly in their body, to the point that, so you're out of body, sort of astral channeling or astral traveling, but then you can also be so focused in the body that one is completely in a trance, they don't see the outside world. In fact, the word trance comes from an old English term referring to or an old French term, in fact, referring to the passing or transitioning from life unto death. Now, trance can be cultivated. There's things you can do so you can go into trance more easily. You can do biofeedback, which is sort of like you get set up with machines, and then you like practice manipulating your body and getting your head in different states to sort of lower or raise your blood pressure or your heart rate or whatnot. There's self-hypnosis, in which you can actually begin to use hypnotic suggestion on yourself. So sort of by like stating things in your head or things out loud to kind of alter your head. Then there's straight up hypnosis or mesmerism, where you're put in a very relaxed state, and then you kind of can enter a trance. And people who have the aptitude to be hypnotized, the more they are hypnotized, the more they can enter that hypnotic state more easily. So some people are found when they're in trance to experience visions, whether this is controlled or spontaneous possession. So a controlled possession would be you decide to become possessed, to invite the deity within, or spontaneous, it just happens. Others will use trance to be stronger, to withstand pain, to create focus. So you can go into a trance, as you can see this gentleman here with a trident through his cheeks. This is actually somewhat common in South India. People will say, I will take this vow to God so that I will, my kid will, that I'll get into grad school, or that my kid won't get sick, or I'll get a new job or something like that. And part of this vow is they do a bodily mortification or a manipulation of the body, such as piercing the tongue, piercing the cheeks like this. People will also, they'll put metal hooks through the skin in their back and then pull small carts with them. And when this is described, when the people describe it, they'll often say, oh, I didn't feel any pain, I didn't feel anything, I was just thinking about my devotion to God. So they're very much in a trance state. I mean, I've seen people go into a trance state and then be able to lift and do like strongman type stuff. So there are ways that the mind can manipulate the body. It's suggested that trance can be simply experienced by a long, repetitive video game session. So when you're playing a video game for a long period of time and your brain goes into like hyper focus, that in of itself has an element of trance to it. I'm bringing all this up because we don't think about trance, we don't think about possession all the time, but we have elements of trance and possibly even elements of possession that are common in the West. Stephen King wrote about writing when he sits to write fiction. He says it's like he goes into a trance as he just writes. It's like dreaming while being awake. Catherine Erndl reports that folks experiencing spontaneous possession, so they just boom, the bhav ana, the feeling comes, the wind comes, the goddess comes. What happens is people will have that experience spontaneously, or it'll happen unexpectedly. But over time, they'll cultivate techniques so that they can predict their possession coming, or they can consciously enter that possession state. So what about some complications to this situation? A person who's in a trance is still that person. It's not like you become a different person, or do you? But the person who's possessed loses their memories and becomes another creature. You are still your body, but everyone who comes out of possession, they always say, I have no memories. I assume it went well. The other entity is acting, even though you're still in your body. So my question always happens to be is when someone is involved in a possession state, where does their individual ego go? And we don't have a real good answer for that. In a sense, this sort of goddess or God takes over the person. But as Erndl also says, the person also takes over the goddess. There's a both and. So while the person is possessed, they are acting as the deity. but they're also revered for their connection to the deity. And there's a sense that there's an intermingling where the deity becomes the human and the human sort of becomes the deity. This leads to the question of authenticity and performativity. So are they just acting out a set of possession patterns? Is the trance real? And we read in Erndl about how a lot of people challenge folks who are possessed, especially when they're becoming possessed regularly or at a specific time. And she writes about one guy who would go by and take an iron bar, poke somebody really hard, say, "Are you still really possessed?" And I think the same guy was saying that if you take a lit incense, like coal, incense stick, and put it right under somebody's nose and they don't flinch, then you can tell that they're genuinely possessed. But if they go, "that's horrible," then I'm like, "Aha, you're not really possessed." I don't know. Going around and debunking people who are possessed and in trance is not terribly interesting to me. I think it misses the point. Is the person just acting out a set of patterns? Does it matter? I don't think it does. So in possession, a person's mind, speech, and I don't know, even their soul becomes something else. Some invisible creature becomes embodied in the person who is possessed. Unlike trance, for instance, the person loses agency and control, ceding control to the entity who does the possessing. So in trance, you can come in and out of trance, but in possession, you are gone. It is only the entity that is there that is acting. Now, in malevolent possession, which we saw in the last module, it does sort of resemble demonic possession in the West. But in India, demonic possession is thought to manifest in physical and mental illness. So in the West, we'll talk about people kind of going crazy and becoming evil or doing crimes because they're possessed. In India, it's often said that physical illnesses and mental illnesses are the result of possession. So in Tamil Nadu, we saw that the possessed women were caught by these pays, these frustrated male ghosts, and caught also in a system that made their frustrations into the symptoms of possession and then locked them into a ritual that remade them into good wives. Now, if you want to think about possession in the West, you have to go to probably the most famous case of possession. And no, I'm not going to say the story of The Exorcist, but the book of Mark. So let's look at the good book. I always cite from the King James Bible, which was put together by sort of like if you know much about the history of the King James Bible, it was a translation that was put together by the best and the brightest poets and artists of the day. Some argue that maybe even Shakespeare worked on it, but it is a work of great world literature. And personally, if I am going to look at the Christian Bible, I like the King James. Don't give me that new international version nonsense. Don't give me the Blue Jean Bible, the Good News, or the Bible for Kids. I like the King James. So I want to read to you from the King James a little bit. So this is from the book of Mark, and that's a gospel in which Jesus is, I think, way cooler because he's basically like an exorcistic visionary and he has more miracles and whatnot. But we're going to talk about what was going on with Jesus and his disciples. They are traveling around their area, and then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes. I don't speak Hebrew or Aramaic. And when he had come out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs. And no one could bind him, not even with chains. Sounds like a tantrika to me, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been pulled apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces. Neither could anyone tame him. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshiped him, and he cried out with a loud voice and said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by that Spirit that you do not torment me." And this is part of, in Christian lore, they'll say, it's like, look, even this demonic entity, this evil entity, knew Christ was the Son of God. And that's a proof that he was the Son of God. Then he asked him, "What is your name?" And he answered, saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Also, he begged him earnestly that he would not send him out of the country. So the demon doesn't want to take off. He likes to be hanging around. Now, a large herd of swine was feeding near the mountains. So all the demons begged him, saying, "Send us to the swine that we may enter them." And at once Jesus gave them permission. Then the unclean spirits went out and entered the swine. There were about 2,000. And the herd ran violently down the steep place into the sea and were drowned in the sea. So those who fed the swine fled, and they told it what had happened in the city and in the country. And they went out to see what it was that had happened. Then they came to Jesus and saw the one who had been demon possessed and had the legion sitting and clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who saw it told them how it happened to him who had been demon possessed and about the swine. Then they began to plead with him to depart from the region. And when he got into the boat, he who had been demon possessed begged him that he might be with him. However, Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has had compassion on you." And he departed and began to proclaim in Decapolis all that Jesus had done for him, and all marveled. So we got a lot going on here. We have somebody who's possessed, not possessed by one, but by many. Then after he is sort of exorcised, he comes back to normal and he wants to be a disciple, but Christ says, "Nope, you got to go and spread my words," and we never hear about him again. I wonder, does he get repossessed? Does he get possessed again? I mean, does his ability to, because he's been possessed, has now been exorcised, does he have the ability to cast out the demons in the future against other people? It's hard to say. There's a lot going on here, and this is one of my favorite stories in the Christian Bible. Okay, so in benevolent possession, not malevolent possession, and here we see a Tayam dancer at the top. We'll get more into that in a second. And at the bottom, we have a Kumari from Nepal, who is thought to be an emanation of the goddess. And many of the Kumaris will go into trance states and speak prophecy and whatnot. I can't really get into the Kumari right now, so that's a whole other day. All right, so benevolent possession can be spontaneous or it can be cultivated. Spontaneous possession is a quick trance with no trigger, or you're in a religious context and it just sort of happens. Now, cultivated possession is a spiritual and ritual practice, and folk will find greater ability over time to enter trance and become possessed. It is a blessing, not an affliction by any means. The person possessed is worshipped along with the thing or entity or God or spirit being that is possessing them. The person thereby becomes sort of like in a state of holiness and is considered to be identical to the God while they are possessed. Hindus worship images, you may remember, so murtis, sort of the bodies of the gods in temples, that are thought to be material substances that have been enlivened, that have God installed in them. It's just a stone or bronze image until they put the deity within them. So something similar is happening with possession, in that the deity comes into a living creature instead of sort of an image. And we'll remember that when an image is created, it's not considered alive until the deity is installed in the image through a ritual. And the final step, when the deity really becomes present, is when they paint the eyeballs onto the image. Then it's thought to be really, really real. Now, some scholars have argued that possession is entirely performative, that this is just folks acting out. Now, when we look at this closer, interviews and observations suggest altered states of consciousness rather than a manipulative drama or just acting out a script. The entities who possess people, and Erndl argues this, and I agree, should be considered conscious agents who speak through the people. So when we're talking about the person who is possessed, we talk about the person being the deity. So you may have noticed when we were talking about Shanti, when she was speaking as the goddess, Nabokov wrote about her as if she was the goddess. When she was speaking as the Pei, Shankar, who had possessed her, you'll notice that in Nabokov's writing, she would just say Shankar says, not Shanti as Shankar or Shankar as Shanti says. So we take these entities seriously. So are these real spirits that possess people? I don't know. I don't care, really. I mean, I don't know. I do a lot of I don't know, I don't care if stuff is real in my work. We're studying human culture and we're studying Hindu culture, and this is one of the many modes. Possession is a mode of religion that enables new religious contents to be generated by the possessed, and it allows folks to witness the gods in person, embodied. So there are two key functions of possession. So sort of societal or religious functions. One, the person who's possessed can speak the words of God, make prophecy, give new scripture, whatever. You can generate new religious content. The other thing that's really powerful is when a person is possessed, other people can interact with the deity who is made into a person, made into a very embodied person, for that matter. So that tells us quite a bit of what's going on there. All right, so trance and possession. Okay. Trance and possession are described widely in India. Sanskrit sources describe possession phenomenon much as we see today. And I would argue that trance and possession should be thought of as a fundamental building block for religion. Now, you have this idea of shamanism, which is a terrible term because it's derived from like a Siberian word, and then it's been over applied to all sorts of religions, but people still use it. When I say shaman, I mean someone who uses techniques of ecstasy, as Iliade said, to go into trances and journey into other worlds in order to gain power and cause effects in this world or gain wisdom. So when I say shamans, I mean, and when I'm talking here, I'm talking about people who actively go on trances to journey to other worlds in their heads, or maybe not so much. So this is very much an element of it's very much an element of trance. In Tibetan, you have these Tibetan oracle figures. So they're really quite common. There's like the Dalai Lama has a very specific Tibetan oracle, but you can see them all over the place if you're hanging around actually in Tibet. These are figures who are ostensibly Buddhist, but they go into a trance and they make predictions using either divination or their own prophecies to cause something to happen. They are very much in trance when this occurs. So yes, and I mean, if you deal with any Tibetan organization, whether a monastery or even the Tibetan exile government, you'll see that they regularly consult these sort of possessed oracles. Okay, so trance and possession are often connected to ritualized dance, surprisingly. So here the dancers become possessed through their costumes and practices. Then they dance, and in that way, they keep the trance going, and they act as gods, giving the experience of the gods to the witnesses. So in Theam, which we read about in Dalrymple today, we saw that they would stare into a mirror and they would become entranced. They wouldn't remember anything, and then they would go out and dance, and they would dance for long periods of time in these incredibly heavy and ornate costumes. Then after the dancing performance, they would sit and people would come forward and take like a darshan, but also ask them questions. And these Theam dancers would speak as the gods, or the gods would speak through them. In Nepal, you have a thing called the Navadurga, which happens in the fall during the sort of 9 nights of the goddess. And here you'll see people that will wander in these ornate costumes, and there'll be 9 of them, and they're all supposed to be different goddesses. And those dancers, in fact, are in trance, and you're not supposed to touch them, and you're not supposed to take pictures of them. I stole these pictures off the internet, but I actually got lucky one time, and I was out in Bhaktapur, and the Navadurga came by, and there were no other tourists. I got talking to a guy. He's like, all right, you can take pictures. But yeah, the Navadurga is it's a festival. It's a larger festival in Nepal in the fall times. But during these, you have these sort of 9 dancers, Navadurga, Nava 9, Durga, the goddess who's difficult to approach, who travel through the streets and people can interact with them. In the West, I like to think about something that's really kind of powerful to me is the sun ceremony in First Nations, mostly of the Plains area, First Nations peoples. And this people will, they dance for hours and hours and hours, and then they have piercings in their chests and sometimes in their backs. And these piercings will be connected to rope that is all hooked up to a large pole in the center. Sometimes when it's in their back, they'll be suspended and they'll kind of swing from the piercings in their backs. In this, you also see sort of a connection of dance, trance, not as much possession. Okay, so the context of our two data sets today are the Indian Northwest and the Southwest. So Kathy Erndl is writing about the area of Delhi near Chandigarh, Punjab, Himachal Pradesh. You can see on the map there. In many ways, this is the predominant cultural zone of India. The India we most encounter in the West, which is why I've tried to do so much with like Bengal and Tamil Nadu in this class and Kerala, because I want to displace that overall emphasis on sort of the Northwest of India. In the Northwest of India, you have pretty wide caste and wealth distribution. The gods all have Sanskrit names, though the godlings and spirit beings will have vernacular names that are non-Sanskritic. Now, Dalrymple is writing about Kerala. Kerala, which calls itself God's own country, is my favorite place in India. I absolutely love Kerala. I cannot speak Malayalam at all, but their temples look different. If you look up on that left there, you'll see that they're wooden and they have a very kind of distinct, almost pagoda-like look about them. It's lush, it's green, it's tropical. If you travel there, you'll invariably get the chance to go on one of these old rice boats that are converted into almost like floating luxury hotels, and you can travel in the backwaters, which is just miles and miles and miles of canals that connect large portions of Kerala. Now, Kerala is a wild, jungly kind of place in which they have quite a bit of casteism. The Brahmins are some of the most formal throughout India. We read about the Nambutris and the Nayars in Dalrymple and just how kind of awful they could be to the untouchables. Kerala has always been known as a land of tantra, magic, and serpent worship. So Teyam, which is this possession and dance that we're talking about today, comes from the Sanskrit word daivam, meaning just deities or holy. It fits with that wild quality. Some people say that Kerala was carved out to be so intricate and as beautiful as it is by Parashurama, who they say went to Kerala and founded the whole state and the culture down there. That was Parashurama's Rama with the axe. Okay, so possession in its process and the function of possession. Dalrymple describes the process of the dancers praying to the god, then slowly getting ready for their performance with the makeup and their costume. Then, before going on, they stare into the mirror until they see the face of God instead of their own. So you look in the mirror, waiting to see that happen. Kathy Erndl describes the common practice of installing the goddess in a lamp. Then there's quite a bit of singing. So Dalrymple describes how do they get possessed? They stare into the mirror and wait until they see the god, and then boom, they're out. When Erndl is writing in the North, she describes a common practice of installing the goddess in a lamp. Then there's a whole bunch of like singing, and these are often like all-night singings. And then the person to be possessed enters into trance and the goddess takes over. She describes about the goddess being just called the Little Mother, the Chinna Amma. They have these jagrats, which are all-night singing vigils in which they sing holy songs called bhajans. She also Erndl describes that other folks in the audience spontaneously enters trance as well. She's describing one case where she's watching a young girl go into trance, swing her hair around, going into trance and whatnot, and then she looks to her left and like a middle-aged woman just boom goes into trance right next to her. In every possession experience that I've encountered in Asia, after the gods dance and play, the person possessed will be consulted and will act as the god and speak as the god. They will also accept offerings that are for the god and dispense with advice and predictions for the future. We saw this in both cases. In India, possession is characterized by glazed eyes, those sometimes wild eyes, whirling of wild hair, and the whirling of wild hair. Remember the discussion of hair that when we were talking about the pays. So who are the people who are possessed? We need to remember that possession is normal. This is not odd for a person possessed, nor for people to witness someone becoming possessed. People actually cultivate possession. In the North and the South, those who intend to become possessed set themselves off to not eat meat, drink alcohol, and they're celibate. Though except when they're possessed, they often drink booze and accept flesh offerings, because when they are when they're possessed by a wrathful deity, that's what those deities like. They like flesh, they like meat, they like booze. We do see that most spontaneous possession cases are female, and that when possession is cultivated, the actor is often male. This is not universal. Just kind of keep that in your head as you're thinking about possession. Spontaneous possession happens all over the place in these all-night singing sessions, when people are just singing in general, and when people go on pilgrimages, because they're so close to the deities, it'll often set them off. I know I was near Bombay one time, and I was at this ashram, and they were having a big function. The guru was doing a big thing, and I lined up to kind of get in the main area. As a Westerner, usually I'd get put right up in front, but because I was at another kind of ritual thing before that, I got put like last in the line. So it was basically me and a whole bunch of folks that didn't speak English in this basement watching the function on TV. And I'm watching the function on TV, and everything seems pretty normal. They're singing songs. The guru gave a little talk. Then they're doing some mantra chanting, and we start really singing again. But I start hearing all sorts of commotion, and I look up front of me to my left, and this dude is just like swinging his arms around, and everybody grabs him, right? But they don't grab him to stop him. They just grab him to keep him from hitting anybody or hurting himself. But so they're just like barely restraining him, keeping him under order. And then I look to another area, and I see a woman start whipping her hair around. And I'm like, this is intense. And I'm singing along at this, sort of thing we're doing. And my brain just started to get really fuzzy. And I looked up at the TV screen, and I saw the guru singing, and the guru's face turned into a skull. And I was like, I am seeing this with my eyes. But it was really profound, as a profound moment. But I wasn't possessed, but I definitely was entering a trance. And for the first time in my life, I lost some time. All I remember was my entire consciousness was just singing these Sanskrit words. That was it. That was all that was there. And since that experience, I have gone into trance more often. It doesn't happen a lot. It usually happens in a Hindu context or in a ritual context. But once your brain experiences that, it can do it again, sometimes surprisingly. Okay, so some scholars have argued that that only low caste people get possessed. Well, Erndl notes that it's all social strata. It's not just the little tradition, as they say, or the folk tradition. She witnesses both Brahmins and low caste folks experiencing possession and revering the possessed. In Team, the people who are dancing are Dalits, or the underclasses, but it's part of a larger system that shows that the Dalits kind of have this amount of agency. We do not see active use of possession to disturb overall social order. So while the Brahmins may depend on these Dalits to perform these rituals, it doesn't lead to them treating them all that much better in everyday life. So I go back and forth on this. Our guy who we were talking about, was his name Haridas, says that Team has made life better for people who are in the underclass, but I don't know. It's hard to say. I'm not completely convinced on that. Many of the folk who are possessed are quite pious and devoted. So you have dancers, you have temple folk, local religious personalities. All of these people can become possessed. Possession is a blessing, not an affliction. In benevolent possession, one may become a holy madman. One might be completely out of their mind and act like a crazy person, but one does not become a general criminal madman, if you will. During holidays and festivals, Erndl writes that women who become possessed pretty regularly will throng to pilgrimage temples and set up shop. They'll put up a platform. They'll have a whole bunch of people who will get possessed almost on command. People will come forward to make offerings and interact with them. So if you were to go on a pilgrimage place in India and see somebody doing this, hang around, take a look at it, see what happens. In Kerala, the possessions happen in very specific contexts. There's a ritual of dance and performance and costume. And where these are done are at temples, but more often at what are called kua or kuva. And kuas are sort of small little shrines, usually dedicated to serpent deities. They have a very particular, they don't have roofs. They're small shrines with a wall around it, and then like usually a number of black stones with snakes on them and whatnot. These are called kua or kuva, and they're sites of rituals that I don't see anywhere else except in Kerala. Sometimes you'll see these days that nicer full-fledged temples will sponsor Teyam, but traditionally Teyam happens among outcast people in jungly, wild places. You've heard me say that word jungly a lot. The word jungle in English comes from a Sanskrit word, well, actually a Hindi word called jungli. So a jungly place is thought to be just a place that's sort of wild and overgrown. Okay, so the outcasts who perform these Teyam dances are usually laborers for the other 9 months of the year. Haridas was trained by his father after he demonstrated an aptitude for it in his youth. And then he was trained by other teachers later on. But when he's not a dancer, he's a jailer in the city, in a regional jail, and he also digs wells. So who are the deities? Well, in the north, the great deities like Shiva or Vishnu do not possess people. Who possesses people? Smaller deities like a Bhairava or a Hanuman. And then there are also, and these are also the gods that are used in exorcisms. These are the Bhutanats, the ghost lords, as I've said. In Kerala, it's gods and goddesses, fierce ones, who take over men in specific Teyam contexts. You don't see women doing Teyam. So goddesses take over men, gods take over men, but it's always men who are doing the performances. The Teyam are sponsored by varied folks. They might sponsor a Teyam in thanks for something, maybe to attend to a problem or to call for a healing. In many cases, high caste Brahmins will sponsor these performances done by Dalits. Now, what about goddesses? So we hear more. We hear about gods and goddesses here. So the goddess who rides a tiger, Shernvali, is an image that's found all over India, but I would not argue she is a single goddess. And in fact, you'll look at this, you'll see these images of a goddess who rides a tiger. You'll say, is that Durga? And they'll say, no, it's Shernvali, which just means she who rides the tiger. In general, though, I think she's a stand-in for a myriad of local goddesses. So many types of goddesses, the smaller goddesses, these protector goddesses, are often worshipped using this image of a general goddess who rides a tiger. So Durga or Lakshmi have their own sort of cohesive mythology, or Parvati for that matter, have their own cohesive mythologies. But here, we don't really have a lot of very like pan-Indian stories about the goddess who rides a tiger. It's also notable that the goddess who rides a tiger never has a male husband or consort. She's always depicted alone. Possession, whether embodied by a male or female person, is most often from goddesses. Goddesses tend to be the ones that possess people the most often. And these goddesses can be separated into 2 categories, one who's Saumya or pleasant, and one who's Raudra or wrathful, crazed, howlers. It's the Raudra ones, the fierce ones, who are most likely to possess. In Kerala, you do have big gods like Vishnumurti, who takes form here, and also Bhairava. Local gods who will, may have a simple name like Mom or Pop or Bup or Pup will possess people. In Erndl, we saw that smaller gods, not translocal gods, do the possessing. So to the end, what's the point? My point is that possession is something that we don't talk about, but it's found throughout India, throughout the history of India. We can find it in text, we find it in practice. It's all over the place. We need to pay attention to it. Possession can, and this benevolent possession, can provide an opportunity for active revelation in which new scripture can be generated and by which people can interact with the gods who are embodied in a single person. The possessed person is, in fact, the god or spirit being. When we look at them, and when we describe them, we should not look at them as a person acting out a part. The human consciousness is gone. It is the God acting. And we should see those people as being embodiments of those gods when we write about them and think about them. We should think about these notions of possession and think about how those teach us things about other religious cultures, such as traditions of trance and possession throughout China, which is where spirit mediumship is a very big deal. And we should also remember, this isn't Hollywood. When we bring up possession, don't think of The Exorcist. You got to think about something else. All right, so that's the end of that tune, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye now.